Hello and welcome to part 44 of this video series. In this video, we will learn about inner exceptions. Inner exception is basically a property that is available in exception object. We can use this property to provide the information about the exception that has caused it. Let's understand this with the help of an example. I have opened up my Visual Studio. If you remember from the last video, we are taking two inputs from the user, basically the first number and second number, and we are trying to divide it. And in the catch block, I have mentioned divide by zero exception. So if my program is throwing divide by zero exception, it will come to the catch block. In the catch block, what we are doing, we are throwing a system exception. Let's see what will happen when we run the program. I will press Ctrl F5. Now my application is running. Let's provide the first number as 25 and second number as 0. So obviously now we will receive the divide by 0 exception. I press enter and you can see we are getting the exception here. And let's read the message here. Unhandled exception. System.systemException. Error occurred in catch block. If you notice, we are not receiving the original exception. Originally, it was divide by zero exception, but because we have thrown an exception from catch block also, the original exception is overridden by this exception. And if you see, it is giving us the line number 30 because at line number 30 we have thrown this exception, but originally the original exception was thrown from line number 22 because at this line we are trying to divide it. So for these type of scenarios where exception has occurred in the catch block and we have lost the information about the original exception, here we can make use of inner exception property and provide the original exception information to the user. Let's see how that can be done, and it is very easy. In the constructor of the new exception, what we can do, we can use a second parameter that is nothing but the inner exception. Let's provide the inner exception here, and we know inner exception details are there in this particular object, so we have provided ex object as the second parameter. Now when we throw the exception, we will see the details of system exception as well as the divide by zero exception also. Let's run the program again. I will press Ctrl F5. My application is running. Let's provide the first number as 30, second number 0. We will get the divide by 0 exception. And if you notice this time, so first we are getting the system exception. Error occurred in the catch block. This is the message we have provided. And you can also see we are seeing our divide by 0 exception also. Attempted to divide by 0. And we can see the line number also, line number 22. At this line, this exception has occurred. And it is clearly mentioned the end of inner exception strategies. So these three lines are coming from the inner exception. Let's do one thing. Let's try to handle this exception also. To do that, we can wrap this whole code, I mean the try block and the catch block, in one more try block. Let's do this. So I will write a try here. And I will move all this code from here to my try block. So now we have nested try block. Let's put a catch block here, and this time let's give exception ex. And let's just put a breakpoint here and run the application in debug mode. Now the application is running. Let's provide some input 21 and again divide it by 0. Now we are hitting the breakpoint here, and let's see what we have received in ex object. So ex is an exception, and if you see, this is attempt to divide by 0. You can read the inner exception property. In the inner exception, we have attempted to divide by 0. Correct? And if you see the ex object having the message error occurred in the catch block, So this way we can have the information about both the exception, the parent exception and the child exception which has occurred in the catch block. On this slide, we have some points about the inner exception. To retain the original exception, pass it as a parameter to the constructor of the current exception. If you notice here in the Visual Studio, we have passed down the original exception as the parameter to the current exception, that is nothing but system exception. Okay. Always check if inner exception is not null before accessing any property of the inner exception object. Else you will get the null reference exception. Let's understand this in Visual Studio. Let's say I want to print the message of the original exception. I will say console write line ex dot inner exception dot message. Let's run the program and provide the input 40 0. You can see we are able to print the original exception, that is attempted to divide by 0. Let's say for some reason we are throwing. Okay, so what we are doing, we are simply throwing an argument exception from line number 24. Let's see what will happen in this case. Let's provide number 60 and 12. If you notice here, we are receiving null reference exception. Object reference not set to an instance of an object. This happened because at line number 30, if you notice, what we are doing, we are trying to read the inner exception. But in this case, there won't be any inner exception because we have not reached to this particular catch block. At this particular catch block only, we are adding the inner exception to our exception object. That's why at this line, we will not be having any inner exception property. If I put a breakpoint here and run the application again and provide some input, and we have reached to line number 39. Let's check the ex object here. If you check the ex object here, inner exception property is null here. That's why we have received the null reference exception. So again, it is very important to check if we have the inner exception, then only access that property. Else we will get the null reference exception. Okay, to fix it, what we can do? We can check if ex dot inner exception is not equal to null. Right? If I run the program again, you will notice we are not getting the null pointer exception now. And to get the type of the inner exception, we can use the get type method. Let me show you how. Let's remove this exception from here. Now here, if I want to check what type of inner exception I have, I can simply use ex dot get type. Okay, so this I can use, and instead of using if, I can get name of that exception, and I can store it in a string. Right, and I can print that exception on the console. Let's run the program. Control F5. Let's enter some valid inputs, or let's provide some invalid inputs so that we will get the divide by 0 exception. I will give the second number as 0, and you can see we are printing system exception. And if you notice, this is the child exception. And if you want the type of the inner exception, you can just change here ex.getType to ex.innerException, and then we can invoke get type on that. Let's run the program again. Y20 0 as second number, and we are receiving divide by 0 exception as our exception type. So this is how you can use get type method to get the type of the exception that we are receiving. And that's it for this video, guys. In the next video, we will learn about custom exceptions.